Well, Genesis chapter 6 is an unusual chapter. Some might even say it's a little weird or bizarre. It's been said when something in the Bible is weird, it's important. And that seems to be true with Genesis chapter 6. It's weird, but it's important. And it's important because it tells us what was happening on the earth that caused God to judge the earth with a flood. What was taking place? What was going on in the world in the days before God judged the earth with a global flood? Look at verse 1 again. Verse 1 says, "Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born to them." So the population of mankind was growing. Remember, God said to man, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." And man was doing that. Man was filling the earth. And it was at that time, it says, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. Now, this is where it starts to get weird for us. The question we need to answer here with verse 2 is, who were the sons of God and who were the daughters of men? And there's two primary opinions about this. Some scholars argue the sons of God were the descendants of Seth, and the daughters of men were the descendants of Cain. And that Seth was a godly line or a righteous line that intermarried with the ungodly line of Cain. So they suggest that this is describing the intermarriage between godly people and ungodly people, which God, of course, prohibits. We're not to be unequally yoked with an unbeliever. So that's one interpretation of this. Now, to me, this view doesn't really make sense because of the offspring that they produce. In verse 4, they produce kind of a superhuman race of people, as we'll see. Plus, the descendants of Seth were also ungodly. They weren't righteous. The descendants of Seth were sinners. They were all judged by God in the flood, with the exception of Noah in his family. So there really is no godly line of Seth that continued on. So for that reason, I don't really buy that interpretation that we're talking about a godly line and an ungodly line, the descendants of Seth and the descendants of Cain intermarrying. So then there's the second interpretation. And the second interpretation is that the sons of God refers to fallen angels, or what we call demons. I told you this is weird. So the sons of God are fallen angels or demons. Now, why do we say that? Well, every time the name sons of God is used in the Bible elsewhere, it always refers to angels. Good angels and bad angels, without exception. In the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was translated about 250 years before Christ, the Septuagint uses a word here that means angels. It says the angels of God instead of the sons of God. All of the ancient Jewish writers believed this was talking about fallen angels. The Dead Sea Scrolls say it was angels. The early church fathers believed this was referring to fallen angels. So then, what's happening here in verse 2? Fallen angels or demons took wives from the human race, forming an unnatural union between demons and humans. Now, it's possible it could have been demon-possessed people, But what you have here, you have an unnatural union between demons and humans. Now, let me give you a few verses for this. If you're a note taker, you're going to want to jot these down. First of all, Jude, verses 6 and 7. There's only one chapter in Jude. Jude, verses 6 and 7 says, "And the angels who did not keep their position of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, these God has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day. In a similar way," now listen to what it says, "in a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion. They serve as an example of those who suffer the punishment of eternal fire." So there Jude talks about the angels who abandoned their proper dwelling, and he compares the angels' sexual immorality and perversion to that of Sodom and Gomorrah, saying in a similar way to the angels, Sodom and Gomorrah also gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion. Well, when did angels abandon their proper dwelling and leave their position and engage in sexual immorality and sexual perversion? Well, Genesis chapter 6 is when that takes place. Another passage for us is 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 and 19. 1 Peter 3:18, which says, "Christ suffered for our sins once for all time. He never sinned, but he died for sinners to bring you safely home to God." I love that phrase. He died to bring us safely home to God. "He suffered physical death, but he was raised to life in the Spirit. So he went and preached to the spirits in prison, those who disobeyed God long ago, when God waited patiently while Noah was building his boat. Only 8 people were saved from drowning in that terrible flood." So it talks about here Jesus preaching to the spirits in prison, those who had been bound for judgment. The spirits were those who disobeyed God long ago in the time of Noah. So that takes us to Genesis chapter 6. The spirits who disobeyed God in the time of Noah. Another passage, 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. There Peter says God did not spare the angels who sinned. And then in the very next verse, Peter talks about the flood of Noah. And then in the very next verse, he talks about the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so the angels who sinned in the time of Noah, again, that is referring us back to Genesis chapter 6. And so the prevailing view, and the view that I hold, is that this is the sons of God are referring to fallen angels or demons who are taking wives of human women. Now, those who reject this view, those who reject that the sons of God is referring to angels, they often cite Matthew chapter 22, verse 30, where Jesus is talking about the resurrection and marriage in the resurrection, and Jesus says, in the resurrection they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. And they say, see, the angels don't marry. So this can't be talking about angels. Well, Jesus was talking specifically about angels in heaven. Genesis chapter 6 is not talking about angels in heaven. Genesis chapter 6 is talking about angels here on earth, fallen angels. Genesis is dealing with a different situation. And by the way, if we're going to be consistent in that same passage in Matthew chapter 22, Jesus was making the point that people will not marry in heaven like the angels in heaven, but people do marry on the earth. And so it's consistent then that fallen angels on the earth can marry like humans on the earth marry. Also, just another kind of objection that people will raise will be that, well, angels don't have gender, or they're sexless. Angels are always referred to in the male gender in the Bible. They're not neuter, they're not sexless, they are always male. And here you have the sons of God who are marrying the daughters of men. In addition to that, when angels appear to people in the Scriptures, they are often mistaken as young men, or mistaken for young men. For example, if you read the resurrection accounts in the Gospels, and the angel at the empty tomb, in the Gospel accounts, the angel at the empty tomb is described as a man. He's not really called an angel, he's described as a man at the tomb. When Jesus ascended to heaven, in Acts chapter 1, verse 10, 2 angels appeared to the disciples as the disciples were standing there looking up into heaven, watching Jesus ascend. And these 2 angels appeared to them. But if you read it, it says, and 2 men appeared to the disciples. We know they were angels by the description that is given of them there in Acts chapter 1. And so we see in Scriptures, that's just a couple examples, and there are many other examples, where angels are often mistaken for young men. So here in Genesis chapter 6, I believe this is talking about fallen angels or demons that began to interact with humankind and intermarry with humankind and produce offspring with humankind. Now why? Why would they do this?